Welcome everyone to the Arcadis Professional Engineers Continuing Education webinar series. I'm Megan Harding and I'm your WebEx host today. For best audio quality, all lines have been muted on entry. You can use the Q&A panel on the bottom right of your screen to submit any questions. We'll do our best to answer them live or follow up with you. If your question is not answered on the call or you have a question afterward, feel free to reach out to the presenters directly. As a reminder, Arcadis is an accredited provider of professional development hours through the International Association of Continuing Education and Training. Compliance with this standard helps to assure that the credits we provide are accepted by many state licensing boards across the country. Approved providers and acceptable subjects do vary, so be sure to check your specific license requirements. Your attendance today is captured when you log in and out of the WebEx. If you are participating with a group, please submit a sign-in sheet. We do have quizzes to help reinforce learning for all of our participants, and PDH certificates can be printed directly upon successful completion of the quiz. The quizzes are optional if you do not need the documentation for license renewal. Now let's get started. Today's topic is understanding the lead and copper rule revision, what public water systems need to know. I'm pleased to introduce Rebecca Sleba and Karen Castellos. Rebecca is Arcadis North America's drinking water practice lead. She has more than 14 years of experience managing drinking water quality, treatment, and distribution system projects. She's worked with dozens of public water systems across the U.S. to identify their unique corrosion-related challenges and evaluate holistic solutions for corrosion control and metals release. She's a member of the AWWA Lead and Copper Rule Technical Advisory Work Group, the Vice Chair of the Distribution System Water Quality Committee, and a contributing author to AWWA M58, Internal Corrosion Control in Water Distribution Systems, as well as M68, Water Quality in the Distribution System. Karen Castellos is a water quality engineer with more than 4 years experience with high-profile drinking water projects, including treatment selection and optimization, engineering design, and regulatory compliance. She's worked with multiple small, medium, and large drinking water systems to assess their corrosion control treatment and goals, and supported various utilities in developing lead service line inventories, service line materials identification, lead sampling, and demonstration studies. She's a member of the AWWA Premise Plumbing Committee and is a contributing author to the Water Research Foundation 4713, Full Lead Service Line Replacement Guidance. Thanks for joining us today. Rebecca, it's all yours.
Thank you, Megan. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation. Before we get started, just wanted to go through a couple items. First, as you see on this slide, we're going to have many acronyms and abbreviations that you'll see or hear throughout the presentation today. I'm not going to read through all of these, but want to note that these are available in your handouts if you need to refer back to them. Second, what you'll be hearing today is our best interpretation of the rule. We have been able to clarify some items to date, but there is definitely still additional guidance or clarification needed, and we will do our best to point out those components as we move along. Last, there is a lot to this new rule. As such, we're not going to be able to cover everything today. We're going to try to focus on the more significant changes and some of the earlier action items. And as Megan said, we'll try to address any questions that you have during the presentation and follow up after. So jumping into the learning objectives, after this presentation, you should be able to explain the overall objectives of the final lead and copper rule revisions, describe key requirements of the revisions and associated compliance schedule, recognize where additional clarification or guidance is needed, and identify actions that water systems or you can take to achieve compliance. Our agenda largely follows those objectives, so I'll start out with an overview of the LCR and the final revisions, jump into some of the key requirements, and then turn it over to Karen to talk about some, and then we'll close with some final thoughts. So jumping into the overview. The lead and copper rule was established in 1991 to protect human health by minimizing lead and copper in drinking water. largely through reducing corrosion and leaching of these metals from service lines and either premise or household plumbing. Instead of establishing MCLs or maximum contaminant levels, EPA established action levels of 15 parts per billion for lead and 1.3 milligrams per liter for copper. So compliance is based on the 90th percentile of all first draw samples collected from customers' homes during each monitoring period. And while an action level exceedance is not a violation, it does trigger additional requirements, including additional monitoring, treatment, public education, and where the lead action level is specifically exceeded, lead service line replacement. Since its promulgation, we have come a long way in reducing lead and copper, as you can see on the right-hand side. From one system, this is Massachusetts Water Resource Authority's data from their website. So in an industry, we've really made good progress, but we have recognized that there are significant or were significant implementation challenges to this rule and definitely room for further improvement. So it has been a very long road for revising this rule. Really, since 2004, this has been a focus nationally since EPA decided to assess lead levels across the country, largely following higher elevated levels in DC water system. And since then, we have gone through many stakeholder processes, additional analyses to better understand how we can improve this rule. So now the revisions are finally here. They were officially released in the Federal Register on January 15th of this year. And while there is still some uncertainty, particularly around the current administration and how that may impact implementation of this rule, we really just want to stress that it's important to get started today, because as you will see throughout this presentation, there is a lot to do. So don't wait. So the overall objectives of the revisions are to improve public health, really through a more proactive and holistic approach, focusing on earlier actions to reduce risks, largely around lead in drinking water. In addition, the revisions do improve transparency and communication to better protect children and families and give them the materials to better protect themselves from risks. The rule includes several new items, which we'll talk about, and significant modifications to largely all of the main components of the rule, with the exception maybe of source water monitoring and treatment. And we're going to be talking through each of these as we move through the presentation today. And really, now the clock is ticking, right? So we've got essentially less than 3 years for complying with some of the significant items, as you can see on this timeline. So rule published again January 15th of 2021. By January 16th of 2024, systems will need to have developed their lead service line inventory and lead service line replacement plan, prepare for the new trigger level and Tier 1 notification requirements, begin delivering lead service line notifications, as well as conducting find and fix assessments and school and childcare monitoring. And then shortly after that, by July 1 of 2024, systems will have to identify their appropriate sample locations and update their sampling plans and have trained staff ready to go with a brand new protocol for sampling where lead service lines are present. So a lot to do, again, in the next 3 years or so. So now I'll start with some of the new requirements. So the proposed or the final rule did maintain the current maximum contaminant level go of 0 for lead and the current action level of 15 parts per billion, but it does require a more comprehensive response if the action level is exceeded and introduces a new trigger level of 10 parts per billion, as you can see on the slide here. So the trigger level is really designed to compel systems to take more progressive actions before exceeding the action level. It can include more frequent tap sampling, optimization or reoptimization of corrosion control treatment, full lead service line replacement based on a predetermined goal rate, and annual notification about your lead service line replacement program and opportunities for your customers to replace their lead service line. And we'll talk about each of these in more detail as we move through the presentation as well. The other big change is around notification. So given that there can be adverse health effects as a result of short-term exposure to lead, EPA has changed two components. First, the exceedance of the lead action level now triggers a Tier 1 public notice. So systems must provide this public notice to all persons served in the system within 24 hours. So similar to E. coli situation or other acute health risks. And it's a little bit of a challenging message to communicate to customers as the exceedance is not based on a single value. 15 parts per billion is not a health-based value, and there will be samples above that value that may have been collected early in the monitoring period. So to really help close that gap, EPA is doing two things. One, that notification has to be performed within 24 hours of receiving and calculating the 90th percentile. So not necessarily at the end of the monitoring period. It's as soon as you receive the information or are able to calculate that value. Second, you must notify persons served by a tap sample as soon as practical, but no later than 3 days if the result is above that 15 part per billion action level to give them information so they can take action to reduce their risks. So these are really short turnaround times. So it's recommended systems prepare in advance, including having notification templates complete, deciding on how you are going to distribute these materials if needed. While exceeding the trigger level or action level is not a violation, remember it triggers more action. Not completing the notification on time is a violation, so it's really important to be prepared here. Another new item, which was included in the draft rule, but has been clarified some in the final, is find and fix. So for any compliance sample that results in lead above 15 parts per billion, systems would need to first conduct a CCT assessment to understand if changes in the system are necessary. The way to do that is you will have to focus on water quality parameter monitoring. So you're going to have to go and sample water quality parameters within 5 days. That's extended to 14 days for small systems without existing corrosion control treatment. And that has to be collected within a half mile in the same pressure zone on the same size main or smaller. If you have a site that already meets this criteria, you can use it. If you don't, you have to add a new site to your water quality parameter sampling pool until you reach up to 2 times the standard number of water quality parameter sites. The other piece of the assessment is conducting a site assessment to identify the lead source specifically at the home. So within 30 days, you have to go back and collect a follow-up lead tap sample. Alternate protocols are allowed here, so it doesn't have to be the first liter compliance sample. If you're unable to sample, the system would be required to document 2 attempts if they're non-responsive and the reason for that and submit that to the state. Once you've conducted those assessments, if it's within your control, you need to take action. Those actions could include flushing or adjusting CCT, such as adjusting chemical doses. If you find, however, that it's due to a source at the site, or if you're not able to determine the specific reason, systems are not required to recommend additional action. But you do have to report the cause and the action to the state within 6 months of the end of the tap sampling period for any individual sample, again, above 15. And the last new component that could have significant impacts is around schools and childcare facilities. So all community water systems must develop a complete list of schools and licensed childcare facilities, and that licensing may vary a bit by state. That has to be done again by the compliance period or date, which is January 16th, 2024. After that point, you have to provide annual education to the entire list of schools about the health risks around lead, information about the sampling program, and instructions for sampling, as well as the 3Ts toolkit. You can see the cover of the 3Ts document on the right-hand side of this slide. Then within the first cycle, which is the first 5 years after the compliance date, community water systems will have to collect lead samples at 20% of elementary schools, and at each school, that's 5 samples, as well as 20% of childcare facilities, and that's 2 samples per facility. You have to document facilities that do not respond or decline participation. And then also secondary schools, if requested, you would have to sample those as well, but that's not required, only upon request. After that 5-year cycle, systems would be required to conduct sampling upon request only for all elementary, secondary schools, as well as any childcare facilities. I did also want to note that the water system, school or childcare facility, or other trained individuals can collect the samples. So it does not have to be staff from the utility that goes in and does the sampling here. And now I'll turn it over to Karen to talk about the lead service line inventory and replacement.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. So I'm going to start off by discussing what is a service line. This is an example infographic from the Lead Service Line Collaborative that just shows the typical composition of a service line. So on the left-hand side is the water main, then it's the corporation stop, which is typically the valve between the water main and the service line. Then there is, in some systems, they have a gooseneck, pigtail, or connector between the water main and the service line. It's approximately 2 feet in length that's made up of flexible pipe. Then from there into the home is the service line. So the ownership of the service line can differ from system to system. Some systems share the ownership of the service line with the customer, so the system may be responsible for what is between the water main and the property boundary or the curb stop, for example, and that would be considered the public side. And then the customer would be responsible from the property boundary or the curb stop into the home, and that would be considered the private side. Some systems do not own any portion of the service line, however, they may be responsible for what is in the public space. So how are service lines defined under the lead and copper rule revisions? Generally, they state that the service line is the pipe between the water main and building inlet. However, for inventory and replacement purposes, this is how we are understanding their definitions. So they're categorized into these 4 categories. There is a lead service line, which would be a lead pipe in between the connector and the interior plumbing of the home, which is for understanding. Then a lead status unknown would be unknown pipe material between the connector and the interior plumbing. A new category is this galvanized requiring replacement, and that would be a galvanized service line downstream of a lead service line at any point in time. So for example, the system had a lead service public side that was replaced, but the customer still has the original galvanized service line, that would still be considered galvanized requiring replacement. And the last category is lead connectors. So those could be lead goosenecks, pigtails, etc., with a non-lead or galvanized pipe between the connector and the interior plumbing of the home. So in what cases do these count towards your replacement rates if you are triggered into replacement? In the cases of lead service lines, if all the lead is removed as part of that replacement, it counts as a replacement. If you find lead for a lead status unknown and all of it is removed, that counts as a replacement. If you remove the galvanized line with any preceding lead, that counts as a replacement. However, if you replace lead connectors, that does not count towards your replacement rates. But if you do encounter them as part of planned or emergency work, you are required to replace them or offer to replace them if they're customer owned. And I will talk about disturbances a little bit later, but in all of these cases, these do require public education when disturbed. As part of the lead and copper rule revisions, all systems must develop a lead service line inventory, and that's to help systems better inform the public about the potential risks of lead and allow customers to take actions to better protect themselves and their families. The actual format of the inventory is flexible. It can be a list, table, or a map with a location identifier. And that location identifier can be an address, but it doesn't have to be. It could also be a street, an intersection, or a landmark. On the left-hand side is an example inventory that we put together. Those colors are not mandated. That's just for visual representation. The systems do have to specify what the service line material is on both the public and private side, and they have to be categorized as lead, galvanized requiring replacement, non-lead, so non-lead could be, for example, PVC or copper. Systems do not have to specify what type of non-lead material. However, it's recommended that they do record that information for better communication with their customers and for better capital planning. And then the last category is lead status unknown. This inventory does have to be publicly available, and if you are a large system serving greater than 50,000 persons, it has to be available online, so on your website. The inventory does have to be regularly updated, and now we'll go into ways you can update the inventory on the next slide. The entire inventory has to be completed within 3 years of publication of the rule. Since the rule was published last month, the clock is already ticking, and it's due on or before January 16th, 2024. Systems have to submit an updated inventory annually or triannually based on tap sampling frequency. If you do exceed that action level and you are triggered into 6-month monitoring, you only have to submit annually. You don't have to submit every 6 months. The exception is if you are a system who has no lead service lines. You still have to complete an inventory and still have to make that inventory publicly available with information as to why your service lines are non-lead. However, you do not have to provide updates or submit an updated inventory annually or triannually. Once your inventory is complete, you have to notify customers who have lead, galvanized requiring replacement, or status unknown service lines within 30 days of publication of that inventory. And then annually thereafter, you have to continue to do outreach to those customers until their lead or galvanized requiring replacement is replaced, or until the lead status unknown is determined as non-lead. You must also include instructions for accessing your inventory on your consumer confidence report. An example could be if you are a large system, you could put a link to your website or a QR code that goes directly to your inventory. So what information can be used to build an inventory? To help create your initial inventory, if you already have some good materials and identification by going out and excavating or doing potholing, that is a great resource. You can also leverage your water system records, such as tap cards, or your existing GIS for distribution system maps and drawings, installation and maintenance records. You could also look at plumbing codes, permits, and records in the files of the building departments, which could indicate the service line materials used to connect the water system and the customer-owned structures to the distribution system. You could also look at tax records. We found them to be a useful source for home age, which can either be correlated to the plumbing codes or ordinances. If you know when lead was banned in your area, you can also coordinate it with an approximate time as to when lead was installed. As I mentioned earlier, you do have to regularly update your inventory, and there are some opportunities to help improve that inventory. If you're doing water main repair or replacement and you're already going out there and digging up near the water mains, you could identify the public side service line material. If you are doing water meter replacements or readings, you could look at what is on the private side of the service line. If you are going and doing water quality or find and fix inspections inside the home, that is another great resource for identifying the private side of the service line. In all of these cases, this could be recorded on paper. However, we have been working with systems who are using mobile devices or mobile applications to help record and update that inventory in real time. Another option is to have the customers identify the service line material themselves. So I know there are some good brochures and infographics, and some systems even have designated websites on how customers can actually identify the service line material from their home by using lead swabs or scratch tests, and then upload that information and provide that information to the system. The last category is predictive models, and those can help assess the probability of lead and can be useful for meeting the full lead service line replacement goals if you're triggered into replacement while reducing costs from additional excavations. And last, I do want to note that the state may determine acceptable methods for identification to accommodate for resources and system size. An example would be, would they accept that customer service line material identification? So if you find that your system has lead service lines, galvanized requiring replacement, or lead status unknown service lines, you have to develop a lead service line replacement plan. This plan is pretty extensive and includes a variety of different things. It needs a strategy for determining those lead status unknown service lines that I just mentioned earlier on the other slide. It needs procedures to conduct full lead service line replacements. So how are you going to coordinate with the customers? Who's going to do the replacements and how are they going to do the replacements? Need a strategy for notifying customers prior to full or partial lead service line replacements, either as part of planned work or emergency situations. If you are a medium or large system, you need to come up with a lead service line replacement goal rate in the event of a trigger level exceedance, and that has to be approved by the state. This is especially important if you think that your system is going to exceed the trigger level, to come up with a realistic goal rate that you know your system can meet. You also need procedures for flushing after lead service line replacement. An example would be high velocity flushing, where you do all taps at once for 30 minutes with the aerator removed. You also need a lead service line replacement prioritization strategy. So who will have their lead service line replaced first? Will it be those with verified lead service lines, those as part of disadvantaged communities, or those who are most sensitive to lead? You also need a funding strategy for customers who may not be able to replace the private portion of the service line. And all of this has to be submitted to the state by that compliance date of January 16th, 2024. So this is definitely incentive if you only have a handful of lead service lines to get those out of your system. There are some additional changes around lead service line replacement. As part of the original rule, test outs were used. So test outs are if the system exceeds the action level, you can take a lead sample directly from a lead service line. And if that result came back below the action level of 15 parts per billion, it was considered replaced through testing. So that practice is no longer allowed. EPA is also discouraging partial lead service line replacements. They're doing this by not allowing systems to count partials towards their goal or mandatory replacement rates. And they're hoping that systems will have a good faith effort to coordinate simultaneous replacement to reduce the amount of partials in the system. They're also, if you do have a partial lead service line, you have to keep that in your inventory and continue to do outreach to those customers. Another change is customer initiated replacement. So if the customer replaces the private portion of the service line within the past 6 months, the system has to replace the public portion within 45 days of notification of that replacement. And as part of the final revisions, the system can extend up to 180 days to accommodate for weather and other resource factors, as long as they notify the state. All right, I'm going to dive into the actual lead service line replacement itself. So if you are planning to do a lead service line replacement, especially if you're planning to do a public portion lead service line replacement, you have to notify customers and owners at least 45 days prior to work. And in that notification, you must offer to replace the customer-owned portion. However, you are not required to pay to replace that portion. And then following any replacement, so either a partial or full lead service line replacement, the system has to provide education around the potential for elevated lead. Risk mitigations. Risk mitigation could be, for example, daily flushing before you use the water for drinking or cooking. Flushing procedures to remove particulate lead, so that could be high velocity flushing after the lead service line replacement. The system also has to provide a pitcher filter or a point of use device with replacement cartridges for 6 months worth of use, along with instructions on how to use the filter, how to replace the cartridges, and in the case of point of use devices, how to install it on your faucet. The timing for providing this information to the customers can vary depending on the situation. If it is part of planned or emergency replacements, it has to be provided before the customer's water is turned back on. However, if you're notified of a private portion replacement that a customer replaced themselves, you have to provide the pitcher filter education and flushing procedures before or within 24 hours. And then the system has to offer to collect follow-up tap samples between 3 to 6 months after the replacement and provide those results to the consumer. And that tap sampling protocol is up to the system on what they want to use. You also have to update your inventory with a new service line material and your compliance sampling pool if needed. For example, if you replace the entire lead service line, it is no longer a tier 1 site and you need to update your compliance pool. So when is a full lead service line replacement required? Rebecca's going to talk a little bit later on how to calculate the 90th percentile, but if your 90th percentile is below the trigger level of 10 parts per billion, you will continue to do customer initiated and routine lead service line replacements with the associated outreach. If you are above the trigger level but below the action level, you have to implement lead service line replacement according to the goal rate that you coordinated with the state on. And that has to be continued to replace until you are below the trigger level for 2 monitoring rounds. So if you exceed the action level, you are triggered into annual monitoring. So that would be for 2 years. If you exceed the action level, you have to implement lead service line replacement at 3% annually based on a 2-year rolling average. And that could mean 1 year you do 2% and 1 year you do 4%, and it just has to be 3% over 2 years. And you will continue to do that replacement for 4 monitoring rounds until you are below the action level of 15 parts per billion. And in the case of an action level exceedance, you are triggered into 6-month monitoring, so that would be for 2 years. I do want to note that small community water systems and non-transient non-community water systems have the ability to choose their compliance option. But if they do choose lead service line replacement, they have to complete lead service line replacement within 15 years. Rebecca talked a little bit earlier about public notification after an action level exceedance, but what do you have to do after a trigger level exceedance? If you find that you calculate your 90th percentile is above the trigger level, within 30 days of the end of your monitoring period, you have to provide lead service line program information and opportunities for replacement to all customers who have a lead service line galvanized requiring replacement or a lead status unknown by mail or another state approved method. This is how we're interpreting that outreach from the final revisions. If you fail to meet the lead service line replacement goal rate for a trigger level exceedance, you have to conduct one of these activities after the first year. So certified mail, town hall meeting, community event, phone, text, email, etc., to provide information about your program. And then if you continue to fail after the first year, you have to conduct one of those activities as well as 2 additional activities, such as social media campaign, newspaper, TV, radio ads, contacting local plumbers and contractors, or actually going door to door and visiting customers to provide them information around your program. Lastly, I'm going to talk about disturbances. So disturbances have the potential to cause temporary spikes in lead. EPA has categorized them into these 2 minor and major. Minor disturbances could be, for example, turning on and off a valve, from water shutoffs or bypasses. And in those cases, systems have to provide education around the potential for elevated lead and a flushing procedure to remove particulate lead. Major disturbances could be from water meter replacements, goose pigtail connector replacements or repairs. You also have to provide education and a flushing procedure as well as a pitcher filter or a point of use device with 6 months worth of replacement cartridges. And those have to be provided before the consumer's water is turned back on. All right, I'm going to hand it back over to Rebecca, who is going to talk about tap sampling and wrap up the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Karen. So jumping into tap sampling, there are a number of revisions. First, want to talk about the specific tiering criteria or site selection criteria. So as you can see here, EPA revised the tap sampling criteria to now include 5 tiers to give priority to the highest risk lead sources. There are some differences between community and non-transient, non-community water systems. I'm going to focus largely on community systems. So tier 1 and 2, this is where we're focusing on the highest risk sites, which are single family structures served by lead service lines or multifamily residences served by lead service lines. The next tier, which is a brand new tier, tier 3, includes those galvanized service lines that are currently or were previously downstream of a lead service line, as Karen talked about. The slight difference here for sampling purposes is that EPA also allows sampling at galvanized lines that are currently or known to be downstream of a lead gooseneck, pigtail, or connector. Tier 4 are now single family structures with copper pipes with lead solder. They did, however, extend or broaden the date here, so it's now where those pipes were installed before the effective date of the state's lead ban, as opposed to the between 1983 and 1986 under the previous LCR. And then last, tier 5 are representative samples where plumbing is similar to that used at other sites served throughout the system. So to be clear, you can only complete your pool with a lower tier if you have insufficient sites for all higher tiers. So if you have lead service lines in your system, you are now sampling only at lead sites served by a lead service line, so Tier 1 sites. Moving over to the protocol, first off, EPA did finalize modifications to the protocol with respect to several actions listed here. So first, systems are not allowed to direct samplers or any customers to conduct pre-stagnation flushing or to remove or clean the aerator as part of sampling efforts. There's also a requirement to use wide mouth bottles, now specifically 55 millimeter diameter or greater. However, take note that many systems have actually measured their current bottles that they're using that are considered wide mouth, and they're typically around 50 millimeters, wide, and haven't really been able to identify many products that meet this requirement. So just note there may be some clarification coming there around the specific size or bottle to be used. In addition, EPA has modified the sampling protocol for lead service line sites. So systems will need to collect the first 5 consecutive liters, as shown here in this diagram, analyze the first liter for copper and the 5th liter for lead. And this 5th liter, is intended to capture water from the service line. And as you can see on this figure on the right hand, data have shown that collecting samples from the service line tend to result in higher levels of lead. So to be clear again, this is for lead service line sites only. Those are Tier 1 and 2 sites. While EPA does view galvanized lines, those Tier 3s, as lead service lines for the purposes of inventory, disturbances, and replacement that Karen talked about, it does not view these as lead service lines for sampling purposes. So Tier 3 sites, galvanized sites, do not follow this protocol. Tier 3, 4, and 5, you would continue to collect the first liter samples and analyze those for both lead and copper. And I do want to stress the importance of these changes. They're not insignificant. So shifting to all lead service line sites and now collecting the 5th liter is anticipated to impact a lot of systems with lead service lines, resulting in higher 90th percentiles and an increased risk of exceeding the new trigger level of 10 parts per billion. If you looked at some of the Michigan data, who recently established regulations similar to these a few years ago, they showed that about 25% of their systems with lead service lines could exceed the trigger level, but want to note that not all of their systems were doing sampling or had verified lead service line sites as part of those initial monitoring rounds. So other estimates have put it as high as or around 40% of community water systems, which is not a small number. So it's really important to understand if this will impact your system. Briefly, I also want to just talk about the compliance calculation. There are strict instructions for doing this. So for systems with all lead service line sites, so if you have all Tier 1, all Tier 2 sites, you're using all the results that you get back in a monitoring period in that calculation. Same if you have only Tier 3, Tier 4, or Tier 5 sites, you would use all the samples that you get back during that period in your 90th percentile calculation. It gets a little confusing though if you have a mix. So if you have some Tier 1 or 2 sites and then the rest of your pool is complete with 3, 4, or 5, the calculation is a little bit different. You have to first use every sample that is available that's served from a lead service line, so all Tier 1 or Tier 2 sample results, and then only the highest of the values from the remaining tiers until you reach the required number of samples. And an example of this calculation is shown on the right-hand side. Lastly, this slide provides some information on the sampling dates and frequencies. So first off, all systems with lead service lines are going to begin using this new protocol and going back to standard 6-month monitoring on July 1 of 2024. So that starts that first 2 6-month monitoring round. Systems without lead service lines can use grandfathered data. EPA also changed the criteria for reduced monitoring based on 90th percentiles. In general, if your 90th percentile is above the action level for lead or copper, you're going to conduct semi-annual monitoring. If lead is above the trigger level, but you're below both action levels, you're conducting annual sampling. If you're a small or medium-sized system and lead is below the trigger level and copper is below the action level, after I believe it's 3 monitoring rounds or 3 years, excuse me, you can go down to triennial sampling. Any system that demonstrates lead below 5 parts per billion and copper below 0.65 milligrams per liter, I believe after 2 6-month monitoring rounds can go down to triennial sampling. And then I do also want to note that there are some additional provisions to reduce copper monitoring. That could be either the number of sites or the frequency. So your sampling schedules may be off. They do not necessarily have to coincide for lead and copper. Last, systems that add a new source or make a long-term change in treatment after, of course, they've been done the appropriate studies and have approval from the state, they must return to standard 6-month monitoring to assess levels in the system as part of those changes. So now I'll move on to the last major topic, which is around corrosion control treatment. EPA included a binned approach for determining specific CCT optimization requirements. Those bins are based on size, presence of lead service lines, your 90th percentile, and whether or not you have CCT in place. So we've tried to summarize that here on the next 2 slides in these charts. I'm going to start off with large systems. So if you have corrosion control treatment in place, and your 90th percentile is above the trigger or action level, you must conduct a corrosion control study. However, I do want to note that the state may approve modifications to a system without a corrosion control study if you're above the trigger level but below the action level. If you have CCT in place and your 90th percentile is above the PQL or 5 parts per billion, but you're below the trigger level, the state may still require a corrosion control study. If you do not have CCT in place and your 90th percentile is above 5 parts per billion, then you have to understand if you have lead service lines in your system or not. So if you do, you must conduct a corrosion control study. If you do not, you can go forward and recommend corrosion control treatment, though the state could always require a study. And in all of these cases, you do have to move forward with modification or installation of the designated corrosion control treatment strategy. Moving on to small and medium systems, just noting here, the items in green apply to both small systems that choose corrosion control treatment as their compliance strategy. More on that in just a minute. And medium systems, and then the blue boxes apply to medium systems only. So again, starting with those that have corrosion control treatment in place, if you're above the trigger or action level, you would be required to conduct a CCT study. Though again, note if you're below if you're in between the trigger and the action level, the state may allow you to move forward with modifications without a study. If you do not have CCT in place and you are above the action level and you have lead service lines, you do have to conduct a study. If you do not have lead service lines, you can just recommend corrosion control treatment, though again, the state could require a study. And then for medium-sized systems only, if you do not have CCT in place and you're above the trigger level but below the action level, you must again recommend CCT. The state could require a study if desired. And again, in all cases, for medium systems and small systems above the action level, you do need to move forward with modifications or installation of the designated corrosion control treatment strategy. There are also very specific requirements for how to conduct a corrosion control study if you are triggered into one. And these look largely similar to the draft revisions, but there are a couple of differences. So first off, the study must consider pH and alkalinity adjustment. You must also consider orthophosphate at a concentration of both 1 and 3 milligrams per liter as phosphate. And if desired, you could also consider silicate corrosion inhibitors. The study can be any of the following. It can be a harvested pipe loop. And I will note that all systems that have lead service lines, regardless of size, if you exceed the action level, you are required to do a harvested pipe loop study. You could also consider coupons, again, for systems that don't have lead service lines. If you do have lead service lines and you exceed the action level, these can only be used as a screening tool to reduce the number of options evaluated in the loop. Other options include partial system tests and analogous systems similar to the current rule. And I do want to note that there are various timeline and sampling requirements based on the bin. A lot of details in the rule, not going to cover that today. Just one note, EPA did acknowledge that pipe loop studies can take a long time to complete. So where systems must do harvested pipe loop studies, they have 1 year to construct and begin operation of the loops and 30 months to complete the study. Both of those from the end of the monitoring period in which you exceed the action level. And then last, EPA recognized that small systems, specifically community water systems serving 10,000 or less, as well as non-transient, non-community water systems, they need flexibility. They may not have the resources to conduct these studies or really to install and operate corrosion control treatment over the long term. So they have the ability to choose from one of the 4 options. That is implementing corrosion control treatment, implementing and maintaining point of use devices, replacing all lead service lines within 15 years or less, or replacing all lead bearing materials within 1 year. So if the 90th percentile for these systems exceeds the trigger level but does not exceed the action level, you could go forward and you would be required to select one of those options and submit it to the state for approval. If you do exceed the action level, you would be required to implement the approved option. And all of this assumes that the state or states will actually adopt these provisions. So to wrap it up, right, the clock is ticking here, right? There's a lot of information to digest, let alone a lot of actions that systems must complete largely within the next 3 years. Again, to summarize, by January 16th, 2024, systems will need to have developed their lead service line inventory and their lead service line replacement plan. They'll need to have identified or begin identifying the appropriate sample locations and update their sampling plans for use in the first monitoring period, beginning in July 1. They'll need to prepare for trigger level exceedances and Tier 1 notification requirements, begin delivering annual notifications to lead service line customers, begin find and fix assessments for any individual compliance samples above 15 parts per billion, and begin sampling schools and childcare facilities at 20% per year. A lot to do in that first, basically less than 3 years to go. In addition, after that first monitoring period is over, right, so December 31st of 2024, you then the following day have to have completed a Tier 1 notice if you exceed the action level, begin lead service line replacement at that 3% per year, and start the CCT reoptimization process. You also have to do lead service line replacement, reoptimization, and some notification if you exceed the trigger level, but you do not have to complete that Tier 1 notice. So the goal here is get started today. And what can you do to prepare? I've got a couple thoughts here on this slide. First, get going on improving your service line inventory. Verify those Tier 1 and Tier 2 sites and get started on updating your sampling pool. And take advantage of opportunities to collect data in the field now. A lot of systems have active meter replacement programs. That is a great opportunity to see the materials, at least on the customer side if they're inside the home, if not on both sides if they are in the yard. Second, develop a path forward to achieve full lead service line replacements. So decide how you would conduct these and how you are going to go forward with prioritizing them if you are required to do them or triggered into it. Look at how you would need to obtain any legal authority to conduct replacements on the private property, and explore funding options, including customer incentives and assistance programs, particularly for low-income customers in your service area. Next, for systems with lead service lines, estimate that 90th percentile, assuming the new revisions for sampling sites and protocols are in place. So understand if you are at a potential for exceeding the trigger level or even the action level because of those changes. And here, right, it's never too early to start a corrosion control study. These do take a lot of time, particularly harvested pipe loops. So if you are able to assess that and get going and think about that plan today, I would definitely recommend it. Last, give some thought to schools and licensed daycares. That's going to start in 2024. So you need to think about getting those lists together, the communication, and how you're going to start to coordinate with those facilities. And last but not least, prepare for rapid notification, particularly that 24-hour turnaround on a tier 1 if you exceed the action level, as well as notification to individual customers above 15 parts per billion. I also want to mention there are some other lead related events coming up. There is a webinar on 4713 project, that full lead service line replacement guidance that the Water Research Foundation has. The date actually changed here. I think it's now scheduled for March 4th, same time. And you can access it here, or you can search it on Water Research Foundation's website. That is open and free to the public. Also, AWWA has the Lead and Water Quality Virtual Summit coming up in April, a 2-day event. That should be a good program as well, with a lot more information around lead and potentially the revisions. So after this presentation, hopefully now you should be able to explain the overall objectives of the lead and copper rule revisions, describe key requirements of the revisions and associated compliance schedule, recognize where additional clarification or guidance is needed, and identify actions that you can take now to start to achieve compliance. So our contact information is noted here if you have any desire to follow up or additional questions after the webinar. And with that, we would like to thank you for attending today's session and are happy to take any questions that may have come in.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rebecca and Karen, for a really informative presentation. I'll start with the first question of where can we get the handouts. Once again, today's presentation has been recorded and the handout will be distributed with the recording. Let's jump into, do the rules about schools include all schools or only schools with lead sources in the service line or premise piping? Great
question. So there is an exclusion in the rule. So any facilities that are built or that replaced all of their plumbing materials after January 1st of 2014, which was the effective date of the Reduction of Lead in Drinking Water Act, do not need to be included in that list and sampling. In addition, there are some provisions for states to waive requirements where sampling has been conducted and met largely the sampling requirement and intent of the rule previously.
Great. So does that also apply to new daycare centers? Will they be need to be added to the inventory?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So my understanding is that you're going to need to develop that list right by the compliance date, which is January 16th, 2024, and then update that list annually. So if your state under their licensing requirements does add any, you will have to add those to your list at that time. And they're asking, EPA is asking for a good faith effort to really try to find those additional facilities. However, again, noting if that facility is constructed or has replaced all of its plumbing after January 1st of 2014, it does not need to be added to the list.
Great, thanks. Another question is asking, what is the definition of galvanized requiring replacement? Is there a galvanized not requiring replacement category?
Karen, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, so how we're interpreting the rule is galvanized requiring replacement would be, in terms of actually for inventorying and replacement purposes, it would be those that are downstream of a lead service line. So if it was not downstream of a lead service line, for inventory and replacement purposes, it would not need to be replaced.
And so just to expand on that, my understanding is that if you had a gooseneck in place, just lead gooseneck connector or pigtail, galvanized downstream of that, that is not considered galvanized requiring a replacement right now. However, again, if you do encounter those goosenecks in main replacement or other planned work, emergency work, you will need to replace that at that time.
Great. Next, let's go to, will the public information on the website have to be customer specific, or will it be based on the entire service area?
If that is related to the inventory, it does need to be customer specific. It does have to give an indication of the materials on both the publicly and privately owned portions. It doesn't need to include an address specifically, but it does need to at least give an identifier, location identifier, such as an intersection or a landmark, so folks can be able to easily locate their own property or where they are residing.
Great, thanks. There's quite a few questions here about the galvanized piping. So if there's anything else you guys can see here and would like to add on, please feel free to do that. I will go to, is there another, lots more coming in. Is there another suggested corrosion inhibitor other than orthophosphate?
So orthophosphate does come in different forms. Those that are most commonly used include phosphoric acid, as well as there are neutral-based orthophosphate products. So those are just salts that do not have as much of a pH impact. All orthophosphate based. There are also products including zinc orthophosphate that has shown to provide some advantages, particularly for cement-lined piping. Those are the most commonly used. The other that is available is silicate-based inhibitor, and some have considered using that and do, particularly where they have open finished water reservoirs and concerns about growth in those from an algae perspective, or concerns about phosphorus loading on downstream wastewater utilities.
Okay, great. A few more questions we have. We're clearly not going to be able to get to all of them today, but see what we can go to next. A lot of the material covered discusses small and medium service systems. Is there a huge difference in the regulations for larger systems? Not the deadlines per se, but the recommendations.
Generally, the requirements and recommendations are similar regardless of size, particularly where systems have lead service lines. So this is going to impact everybody, every size system, and largely all the requirements are similar.
Great. How about, are non-lead materials required to be identified in the service line inventory?
I can answer that question. So they don't have to be specified. So it doesn't have to be, for example, copper or plastic, but it just has to be generally labeled as non-lead. But you do have to specify if it is non-lead or if it is lead, galvanized requiring replacement, or lead status unknown.
Thanks, Karen. Here's an interesting one on the industrial side, wondering if bottled water facilities have testing and compliance requirements for lead and copper levels.
Yeah, so any non-transient, non-community water system, so that could be an industrial facility, right, that has wells on site that they can use for potable use, even if they do not, right? So that could include drinking fountains or bathroom sinks, would be considered and regulated under this, and would have to do the appropriate testing as well as any follow-up if they are triggered into actions because of the new trigger or the existing action level for lead.
We've got just a couple of moments left, but let's try to hit a few more. How about, do private in-home daycares need to be added to the sample list? And is there a best way to identify these facilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the requirements are really going to vary by state, but I do want to note that the rule focuses on licensed facilities. So any that have applied through for a license through their state, those would have to be included. If it's just a small at-home that does not have a license, those would generally not be included in the list.
Okay, so I think we're going to close out there. There are some questions that we have not been able to address today, so we will do our best to follow up and reach out on those. So thank you very much, Karen and Rebecca, for a great presentation today, and thanks so much for our audience for joining us. We flipped to the upcoming webinar slide. Our PE continuing education topic on March 10th will be addressing key questions on microplastics in drinking water. So if you'd like to join us for that, look for an invite or reach out to continuing ed webinars at arcadis.com. So once again, a recording of this call will be sent along with handout. We do hope that you found this webinar beneficial. So please take a moment to give us some feedback as we close. And that concludes today's webinar. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.